Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to follow on from my colleague who was speaking to his SOP around Clause 41, around deaths in custody, because this was a substantial debate at Select Committee. And I take on board the points that was made by David Clingden around the good work that was done to narrow that provision around the circumstances under which an inquest would not be held. But the reason that we still have concerns are threefold. The current clause, as it is written, is still heavily reliant on the medical records as they are written and made available to a doctor, and for a doctor to then make a decision based on those medical records as to whether or not the death would have otherwise occurred naturally. Medical records and the medical care of prisoners, if we're speaking specifically to prisoners, are under the jurisdiction of corrections. They are corrections controlled. There is no ability for external medical provision, really, unless someone is taken out of a facility. And so our concern is that under that current regime, that does raise questions, or it could raise questions for family members around whether or not those medical documents are always the best way for a doctor to make an independent decision. Now, we've always argued for some time that DHBs should be in control of the provision of medical care in prison facilities, in correctional facilities, rather than the Department of Corrections. So that's one of our concerns, and we absolutely accept that currently, in our current environment, we are having people die of natural causes. We are. And that actually would make sense to find a way to filter some of those inquests and inquiries out in custodial care. But our concern is that under the current medical regime within correctional facilities, with the amount of mismanagement that has gone on with the privatisation in those facilities, that we don't believe that necessarily we have a regime that family members necessarily will believe there is enough transparency around. So perhaps if we change the way those medical treatment is provided within our corrections facilities, then there would be a place for that clause. Then that clause would probably be on a much surer footing. We also need to remember this SOP does not only relate to correctional facilities. We're also talking about deaths in custody in mental institutions, mental health institutions, and children in care. Now, I want to ask the Minister, because there has been no contribution from the Minister so far in this debate, and we have raised substantial issues that we've requested a response. I would seek from the Minister a response around whether or not these provisions around holding inquests versus inquiries, when it says relating to deaths in custody, does that relate to children under the care of the Chief Executive? Because in our minds, there should be an inquest on every occasion that there is a death of a child who is under the care of the Chief Executive of Child, Youth and Family. Because actually just saying a child in residence is a very narrow group. There are 5,000 children in care at any given time. And Mr. Speaker, do you know what? Under this clause, they could presumably be determined to have died of what could be considered a natural cause. They could even determine, my question, whether or not Sudi would fall under that example. If a child died who is under the care of the Chief Executive of Sudi, would that only be only result in an inquiry rather than an inquest? Because I have read reports from the coroners where it's clear that the family will get much more closure from an open and transparent process. And if it was their child in care, I can absolutely understand why they would want an inquest rather than inquiry in those circumstances. So 2 points. Is a child who's in foster care considered to be in custody, or the care of the Chief Executive considered to be someone who would always have an inquest? Second question, if, for instance, they die of Sudi, would we then have an example where a doctor would say, no need for a full inquest? And actually, I think that would be wrong, and I think families would be deprived of the closure they need. So those are a couple of the reasons why we have this SOP. I understand the need for there to be greater efficiencies. We're just concerned we haven't got the checks and balances quite right. I want to come to suicide reporting, Mr. Chair. That hasn't been spoken of during this debate. It is incredibly important. I actually had a member of the public contact me and raise the fact that suicide reporting, because as it sets out in Clause 60, inquiries must always be opened into a death where the death appears to have been self-inflicted. But what's the proportion of inquiry, Mr. Chair? Mr. Chair.
Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What is the proportion of inquiries versus inquests for self-inflicted deaths? Now, the reason I ask that is I've had members of the public contact us and say that there are some circumstances where we would do well to have conducted a more robust inquiry into those self-inflicted deaths. A coroner, in fact, raised that in his town, had he not conducted an inquest, he would never have been able to identify that there were actually a string of self-inflicted deaths in his community that had not been connected. So some conversation around where we're making those decisions and why, and whether we're serving those families and communities well by drawing that line would be a useful discussion. But the issue that came up frequently in the debate was around reporting of self-inflicted deaths. Because, of course, under the current legislation, we have very tight criteria. Currently, no one may make public any particular relating to a death suspected to have been self-inflicted until the coroner has completed his or her inquiry into the death. So no one is able to report on a self-inflicted death or give any of the circumstances or even imply that it was self-inflicted. Now, the Select Committee was very clear that actually under the current environment and the way that these situations are often reported, many people are often in breach of this requirement. And in many circumstances, where the media may be compliant, then everyone surrounding the media, particularly in an engaged social media world, are acting in an uncompliant way, and that's causing a real discrepancy in what's happening in reality. We had a very robust debate at Select Committee around these changes, and I think on balance, even though it could be argued either way, I think on balance probably got to a much better place, at least in the current legislation. We now have a situation where, unless an exemption is granted, the requirement now is that if it is being made, an incident is being made public, a person may make public that death as a suspected suicide until a coroner's findings are released. So there is able to be a discussion based on what is suspected to have happened. But there are still limitations, and those limitations are that the method and, for example, the place in which the death occurred, if it suggests the method, may not be publicly discussed. And the reason for that was we tried to look at the available evidence around what may act as triggers or copycat, and the evidence seemed to suggest that method played an important part in those tragedies. And so our responsibility was to try and act as responsibly as possible and find a balance between the reality of the conversations that happen in the public, balanced against what we should still try and restrict in an effort to try and ensure that we do not create flow-on effects from the reporting of suicide. I want to acknowledge, though, the contribution that people made to that difficult debate that we had. Select Committee tried to give it the fullest consideration. We were very mindful that we did not want to, for instance, have members of the public inadvertently falling foul of the law because the law didn't make sense, but at the same time we felt a responsibility to listen to that research and evidence base. So that is the middle ground that has been reached. You can talk about suspected. We must still then wait for a coroner's report, and there are restrictions on the detail that is able to be provided. I think the Select Committee reached as good a place as it could, but I am mindful that probably we will see movement again in the future around in this space as there continues to be rapid development on reporting, but more importantly, what must guide any future decisions will be the evidence and research presented to us. I don't want to be dictated to simply, Mr. Chair, by what the media choose to report relative to what other members of the public are able to put in a blog. I would rather be dictated to by what the evidence tells us is the safest way to report, and with regard to the wider community and those families who are involved in these tragic situations. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Dr. Shane Ritty.